This is WMAZ TV, Channel 13, Macon, Warner Robins, Georgia.
That was the way it all started 30 years ago, back on September the 27th, 1953. And this is where it started, Channel 13's old studios on the Cochrane Short Route. It was a Sunday afternoon when WMAZ TV first began programming to Middle Georgia, and it's continued every day since. For the next half hour, we'll go back into our archives for a rare film look at how things were around here in the early 50s, when television was new and enthusiasm made up for lack of polish. Actually, Middle Georgians found out about the coming of Channel 13 by way of radio.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Helen Farmer reporting the dinner bell news for our sponsors Trice Oil and the Sinclair dealers of Middle Georgia. Well, my friends, we've got really big news today, and it's something this girl has been waiting many months to tell you about, and we're all pretty excited up here at WMAZ, so gather closely around your radios, will you? All set? Well, VHF television has been granted to Macon. WMAZ's application for a television station has been today approved by the Federal Communications Commission. And officials say they hope to have the station on the air before the end of the year.
The old television studios here on the Cochrane Short Route have been silent since 1975, when the station moved into the new building on the Gray Highway. Now this building is only a transmitter site and a storage warehouse, filled with papers, some old film, and memories of the past. Former General Manager Albert Sanders had the distinction of being the first person whose voice was heard on Channel 13.
We signed on the air on a Sunday afternoon, and exactly 2 weeks prior to that, we went on a test pattern. This was part of the government requirement that you go on with a test pattern, and we had to make an announcement. It was about a page in length, as I recall, and Mr. Cobb and Mr. Rankin, who were the main owners of the station at that time, gave me the honor of being the first person to officially have his voice on the air. I recall sitting in the announcer's booth, feeling that half of Macon was tuned in, and I was extremely nervous. I recall that very much, and but I did make it through the script. And
the Reverend Jimmy Waters has been religious director at 13 since day one. He was present at the sign-on that Sunday afternoon in 1953.
First day when the station signed on, everybody did about 10 minutes of what they would normally do. And so we went to our set, for instance, and we did some songs, and my children were very small at that time. Now they have children of their own that size. And we would do our songs, and I'd bring a little thought. And then Uncle Ned was next to me, and he was on next, you see. So, and then Mr. Cobb, of course, was doing the news. He was sitting at the news desk, all these at the same time.
This is the transmitter room, and this is the original Dumont transmitter which took to the air 30 years ago. And this is Jim LAWHON, who was technical director then. The old Dumont still gets pressed into service occasionally when the newer RCA fails.
Technical problems never ceased from the beginning. It was all an extension of radio when you added in video and picture equipment. So we had to learn as we went along, and as I say, especially with tubes and the things associated with that and the heat, there was always one problem after another. Film and its problems, because the film, after you operate it very much, becomes scratchy, and you see streaks down your picture, and where fortunately along came videotape, and that solved that problem. First videotape was put in service around 1961. And it was really amusing to see watch all the fellows through those early 50s years for, 8 or 10 years there, go around mumbling themselves, remembering their lines of their commercials. In 1965, we went into color, and the early black and white days were all done with a camera which tended to burn in, is the term we used. That is, if you sat on one certain scene too long, when you panned away while the old scene was still there. In the beginning, we had a real good crew of engineers who had done radio work all through the years, but adapted to TV very readily. I remember Bill Bryan, Joe Higgison, Ed Disher, who continues, Billy Sowell, Bob Collins, Bob Engel, Schaefer Goodrich, really good crew.
Did you recognize the voice under the slide of TV, the Channel 13 Black Cat earlier? Listen again.
This is WMAZ TV, Channel 13, Macon, Warner Robins, Georgia.
The voice belongs to this man, Jack Owens, one of 13's first staff announcers.
It was a different medium altogether for this area. We had heard about television. We didn't know anything about television, so we had to stumble, we had to fall, we had no teleprompters. We used what we called idiot cards. I know that's an old phrase that you're familiar with. But our experiences were that we were really pioneering, we were learning something new, not only for this particular area of Middle Georgia, but it was something that we all were excited about. Everything that we tried that was new was exciting, and we enjoyed it very much. Well, Jack and Jolly, I think, probably was the show that perhaps I was best remembered from. It was an audience participation program where we had chaperone groups of children, of course, and a lot of the youngsters that were on the show. I never called them kids. I always called the boys fellas, and I called the girls girls, fellas and girls. I could never say kids for some reason. Maybe it was an idiosyncrasy of mine, but what we had was chaperone groups of Cub Scouts, Brownie Scouts, Girl Scouts, up to a certain age. After about 14 years of age, maybe 13, the children or youngsters, I thought perhaps kind of dwindled away from liking that particular type of show. So most of our children who appeared on the show were chaperone groups of children. They were young, kindergarten on up. We had a lot of fun. We had the goodie wagon. We had chocolate cream-filled cupcakes. We had Pepsi Cola, if I may mention a name. We had wieners, hot dogs, just a great deal of fun. And Jolly, the mute clown, was just amazing. Everybody loved Jolly. He was really a joy to work with, too. Now, he worked at the studio, behind the scenes, and his name, if you'd like...
You're not really going to tell us. It's been a secret for 30 years.
It has been a secret for at least 30 years.
But all these kids are grown up now. We're not going to disillusion anybody. Tell us who Jolly was.
Jolly was, in reality, William Cook, Bill Cook. I know you remember Bill. And Bill worked behind the scenes in the production department, I believe, in the slide department, creating slides and working with the film that we had. And he was a real nice guy. He was quiet. Bill was a quiet fellow. And it kind of carried over onto the show. Never said anything. He just did a lot.
There was a person who worked at WMAZ for a period of time. People will remember him. He was Dick Ashby. He did a program called Backstage with Ashby. It was a little variety show. He put some ingenious things into the program.
Dick Ashby, our only Hollywood importation, and a genuine California article. Sideline, successful author. TV line, taking one and all backstage with Ashby every weekday evening. Dick?
Hi, anybody. Well, glad to be with you again for another session backstage. Tonight music and the delicious sight itself of April Stevens. Then the wonderful voice of Carl Ravaza. Before we get into the program itself, let me tell you just a little something about one of my prized possessions.
Dick left us and went to Hollywood, and the last I heard he was still out there and doing some science fiction writing and other show business things. In the early days, television was a very exciting thing. Everything was new. We didn't have a lot of background on to guide us. You had to learn by doing, and in some ways television was much more innovative than it is today because it's tended to get into a pattern today. But that's in no way to say that the productions back then were as good. We talk about the golden age of television, but actually if you take some of those old programs that were on film and you look at them today, you realize how primitive they were by today's standards.
In the beginning, we were a part of all that went on, and around these walls that are in this building right now, we had little stalls, and in here we had our total sets, and everybody had a set all the way around the room. And as I said to you a little earlier, Uncle Ned, when it came time for us to sign off, would play the instruments, and we could hear them playing in the key I was singing in, and it got to be a real interesting thing, and we had just a big, happy family out here together.
I got a little something here, ladies, I think maybe you'd be interested in. You know, a lot of times you get trying to fix a meal around the house. You don't know what to fix. You can't decide. You can't make up your mind. Yet at the same time, you know that you and the family and the kids and all need some real delicious green vegetables. You got it right here in this can of Georgia brand turnip greens. And that's just what they are, Georgia turnip greens. They're grown, they're processed, they're canned. Right here in Georgia by people that know what the score is and they know how to do it.
It was good because everybody had to do it then. That's what made it so real and so good. You couldn't stage it. It just had to be.
Helen Popejoy, who was Helen Farmer then, hosted one of Channel 13's first live talk shows.
An hour and 15 minutes of Hospitality House. 1 hour and 15 minutes.
Every day?
Monday through Friday. Herb Johnson and I co-hosted the show. And it was divided. Do you really want to know how it was divided?
I'd like to know how you filled an hour and a half every day on a talk show.
Well, my family always laughed and said, just give her the chance, that's all. But we, as I said, co-hosted the show and divided it into 15-minute segments. We would have 15 minutes of cooking with the chef from Lindbergh's restaurant. At that time, she was Mary B. Mitchell. Lord love her, she was marvelous. Then we would do 15 minutes of exercises. Now, Herb didn't do the exercises. I did the exercises and would dash madly into the ladies' room to change back again into street clothes to do an interview segment. Then we would have 15 minutes and I would do a beauty bar of how to, different creams and lotions and so forth. Then another interview segment. And then maybe back to cooking. It was unbelievable to think in terms of today's television, what we did and what we accomplished, really. An hour and 15 minutes.
You did your commercials live, too, didn't you?
Oh, I knew you'd bring that up. I certainly did, to answer your question.
There's one thing we found out, and that is that when we use puffin biscuits, we're always sure of a success. And I think when a cook can be guaranteed of what she's cooking, what better feeling could she have? Quick as 1, 2, 3, and as easy as ABC. All you have to do is open a package of puffin delicious biscuits. Remove the foil wrap. Pop those 10 perfectly cut biscuits in a baking pan. Place them in your oven, which incidentally has already been preheated to about 475 degrees. And 9 minutes later, you get the fluffiest, the lightest, the finest textured biscuits you've ever baked.
What's the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you on a live commercial?
Oh, that's easy. The very first one I ever did, it was about a wristwatch from a local jewelry store. It was I will not give the name of the watch. I did what I guess John Cameron Swayze really parlayed into a fortune later. I dropped the watch into a fish bowl with clear water and then took it out and was supposed to say, see? It's still running. And I told the truth, that it stopped. And I just said, well, that didn't work. So
Herb Johnson, he did a lot of things at the television station. He did the weather on the newscast, and he also was a Western character by the name of Single Shot Johnson for the movies, wasn't he?
Yes, and Bill Tribble, somebody, let's say, temporarily secluded his cowboy hat one day. We had a terrible, traumatic situation out at the television station. In those days, we had to drive, you know, all the way out the Cochran Short route. And we had people literally beating the bushes outside of the station, trying to find. I will not tell you who had secluded it. I will not give that information to you. Well, but he wore that to do his Single Shot Johnson stint. Oh, yes. He certainly was a character.
That's about enough for a small boy like me. Let's see how it tastes, huh? Oh, me, my. That is the stuff. Look. Tell Mama, when she goes down to the store this afternoon, to pick up one, maybe two, of these half-gallon cartons of Borden's delicious ice cream. If it's Borden's, it's got to be good. I'm going to finish that dish in just a moment, but I tell you what, it's time to get to that picture now, so you just keep looking right where you're looking, because that picture's coming up right there, right now.
The whole experience was, I think, one of the greatest influencing factors in my life, certainly in my life in communications. It was a real honor. It was, which I didn't appreciate until later. It was a pioneering, and I love to be first.
Middle Georgians have been keeping a daily date with Dell since 1957, when she joined the Channel 13 staff.
Television has revolutionized all our lives, and television is indeed now a part of our daily life, where in 1957 it was not. It was something odd and unusual, but now it is not. So I think that people today feel more comfortable coming into a television studio. They come here with a purpose, whereas earlier they might have been coming to a TV station just to look around to see what was happening in the Macon and Middle Georgia area. It was exciting then, it's exciting now because of all the new improvements and changes, particularly electronically.
This is the stage of the City Auditorium. Back in the 50s, it was the scene of Macon's first live television remotes, Channel 13's coverage of the city elections. Then in the 60s, it was the setting for Middle Georgia's first telethons. Doris Martin took part in those early efforts.
Everything was live, local talent. So you can imagine the confusion backstage. And we were around constantly. You didn't break away for anything. And of course, the place was absolutely mobbed. Television was still awesome, I think, to people in those days. And downtown Macon, so in they'd come all night long, all day long, always a very big crowd. It was just very exciting. The 62 telethon, Donna Douglas, and I thought, oh, she was so much prettier in person and a lovely young girl, and it was so much fun. And of course, that was the good old Beverly Hillbillies, which was enjoying its heyday, and so it was a thrill. Well, the auditorium just packed, people bringing their children, wanting to see her, and you know, it was that kind of an excitement that you can't duplicate now, actually, can you?
And you and Del Ward were
oh yes,
part
Del,
of that telethon.
Very much. Del was a part of it. In fact, Del would open the telethons and then introduce the stars, and we raised a lot of money, Bill, a lot of money in those days, and it was doing it the hard way too. But it was a very localized thing, you know. It was people from Middle Georgia entertaining in between all of this local talent. Television today, of course, is great, and I still enjoy it, but there was a different feeling. It was homey. It was strictly local.
The news has always played a major role in Channel 13's programming. This man was the voice of the news in Middle Georgia for 20 years.
Oh, I did the 6 and 11 for a majority of the 20 years I was there. When the kids got married, well, then I said, I want to see what Mama's like. So I wanted to, Dick Johnson was living then, so they didn't want to do it, but they changed it. And they let me come home, and I did the 1 o'clock. That's when it was on 1. And also the 6 o'clock.
Now, those early newscasts back in 1957, how do they compare with what you were doing when you left in 77?
Well, there was a lot of difference, of course. I guess you've got teleprompters now, haven't you? We didn't have teleprompters, or they were so small you couldn't see the print on them, you know. But actually, you read the copy right in front of you, that's all. And sometimes you read it cold, and sometimes that was dangerous.
Well, let me ask you this now. Equipment was sort of primitive back then, too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We were doing black and white, just black and white. And sometimes we had one cameraman, one camera, one cameraman, two cameras. You know?
Well, for a period of time, of course, the newscast is now produced and prepared and written and tapes edited by other people, and the anchor just basically has to worry about reading it. But back in that time, you did a lot of writing of that newscast.
I used to like to write my own news, but not all the time could I. But, and I was glad some of the other people were around. I wasn't too glad for some of the things I saw, but nevertheless, we got through it. Film was a rare commodity, I'd say. If we could use film, it had to be a pretty important story. Otherwise, we used what was the Unifax machine. And we'd cover national news by just shooting up on these different pictures. But we had a World in Pictures one time. Always enjoyed the interviews, always enjoyed the newscasts. We did the organ shows, you know, and things of that nature.
Mr. Cobb was the general manager of the station. He was also a very well-trained newsman, and was very much instrumental in setting up WMAZ radio in the news business back in the 40s. So as we went into television, and we all had to learn a lot, he elected to be the news editor, so to speak, and to actually go on the air and voice the news. And he did it every evening. I believe the time was 6:15 to 6:30 along there.
No business was transacted at today's session, but Mayor Merritt is expected to announce his new committee appointments at a regular council meeting tomorrow night. On the national scene, President Eisenhower announced today he will leave Washington tomorrow for a brief holiday trip to Augusta, Georgia, where he will golf and visit with his grandchildren.
And now it's time for the latest news from the world of sports. Presented each Monday through Friday evening at 6:35. And now to bring you Middle Georgia's only daily TV sportscast, Bob Savage.
Here are tonight's headlines in sports. Baseball veteran Nick Culloch has been signed as manager of the Macon Peaches. Detroit takes Cleveland 17-16 for the National Professional Football title. And the U.S. wins the Davis Cup.
And working with Bob really was a joy. He was easy to get along with. He knew his trade. He was just a prince of a fellow.
There were other voices and faces in the news over the years. The late Roy Hubbard, beside himself thanks to some early special effects. The late Hugh Beatty, who made the transfer from radio to television news. The late Howard Absalom, who headed radio and television news for many years. Lloyd Harris, whose voice was familiar to both radio and television newscast. And then there's what's-his-name. The face looks familiar, but I can't quite place the name. And who will ever forget this widely recognized close?
From the state capitol, this is Tim Dobbs. That's wrong, too.
For the past half hour, we've looked at Channel 13 as it once was. Now, what about the future?
The future for Channel 13 continues to include high technology. We're going to do and spend the money that's necessary to bring the technology to better serve our viewers. But the thing we're proudest of is our heritage of service to the viewers of Middle Georgia. We're going to continue this heritage on into the future, even with the improvements in technology.
said in the beginning, we feel that WMAZ TV is a great team. You've met the performers, the coaches, you've seen the playing field. We hope that we'll be seeing or hearing from you soon.
This is WMAZ TV, Channel 13, Macon, Warner Robins, Georgia.
That trial here at the Bibb County Courthouse lasted 7 days, and Jet was actually tried only for the murder of her 9-year-old daughter, Marcia. But she was also accused of killing 2 husbands and her mother-in-law, Mrs. Julia Lyles, by administering them doses of taro ant poison. To say the trial was sensational would be an understatement. Spectators jammed the hallways of the courthouse each day and literally fought for the few seats in the courtroom. And Jet remained cool and unemotional throughout the trial. According to the newspaper account, Mrs. Lyles took the death sentence calmly, her head held high. The trial was sprinkled with tales of witchcraft and voodoo, black candles, and sprinkle salt. And Jet's murder spree began in 1952 when her first husband, Ben Lyles Jr., died of arsenic poisoning. Then came the second husband, Joe Neal Gabbert, in 1955, Mrs. Julia Lyles in 1957, and finally Marcia in 1958. Special prosecutors Charles Adams and H.T. O'Neill Jr. charged that the deaths resulted from hatred and greed, that Anjet benefited from insurance policies on the victims. The death sentence was returned at 10:07 on Monday night, October the 13th, 1958, in this courtroom. Anjet's attorneys appealed on the grounds she was mentally incompetent. She was committed to Central State Hospital on the condition that if and when she were judged competent, she would be resentenced to die in the state's electric chair. Anjet stayed at Central State for 19 years. She died there on December the 4th, 1977. Bill Tribble, Channel 13, Eyewitness News. During the past year or so, there have been significant changes both in the operation of WMAZ Television's news department and in the Macon television market in general. And for the first time since the station began telecasting back in 1953, viable news competition has developed in the market. True, WCWB Channel 41 has been doing a hit-and-miss job at news for several years, but because of its generally weak content, staff, and equipment, was never able to draw more than 5 or 6% of the viewers.
Welcome to a Tuesday, 28th day in the month of June. It's a Tuesday. I'm Jim Brown, and here's what's happening in the news. First off, jury selection slated to begin in Milledgeville today in the trial of an escapee from the Milledgeville Youth Development Center. Fabian Wright is charged with the shotgun slaying of 80-year-old former Baldwin County Sheriff Dennis Cox. Wright and 3 other youths had allegedly escaped from the Youth Development Center prior to that shooting occurring. Since then.
But late last year, Macon's new UHF station, WGXA Channel 24, hit the air with a highly competitive newscast.
This is News 24's Late Report with news anchors Donna Fowler and Dave Nema, meteorologist Bob Pape, and sports with Glenn Walker.
They invested in quality equipment and brought in an experienced and for the market highly paid lead anchor, Donna Fowler from WTBS in Atlanta.
Macon City Council tonight has given overwhelming approval to a plan that would provide more than $500,000 for parks and river cleanup. The panel has voted to spend $684,000 in federal jobs money for parks, river cleanup, and emergency home repairs. That action comes on the heels of Mayor George Israel's proclamation declaring June Parks and Recreation Month in Macon. Additionally, tonight there's
And they introduced Macon to its first meteorologist, Bob Pape.
Well, if we take a look at the temperature records, it's 52 degrees 7 years ago, but going back 50 years, Mother Nature saw fit to make it an even 100 degrees, and there are your sunrise and sunset times for tomorrow. But let's go to Macon radar. The 60-mile range is